You can't do this. I am the president. This entire community answers to me. Her shriek echoed across the manicured lawns of the community center, a sound as sharp and ugly as scraping metal. It was the sound of a queen bee being dethroned, a pathetic, desperate buzz that was music to my ears. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, and watched as two plainclothes officers gently but firmly guided her wrists into a set of handcuffs. The final connection in a circuit I had been carefully building for months was complete. It all started with the sun. My name is Sam, and I'm an electrical engineer. For 25 years, I designed and managed power grids for major cities. I understood the flow of energy on a scale most people never think about, from the massive turbines of a hydroelectric dam down to the tiny filament in a light bulb. But a year ago, my personal grid suffered a catastrophic failure. My wife, Clara, passed away, and the light of my world went out. We had bought this plot of land in Harmony Creek Estates years ago. It was our retirement dream. A quiet, tree-lined street, neighbors who waved, and a set of HOA bylaws that seemed reasonable enough on paper. Clara was the architect, I was the engineer. We designed every inch of the house together, a perfect fusion of her artistry and my pragmatism. Our magnum opus. After she was gone, finishing the house became my only mission. It was a way to keep her close, to honor the blueprint of the life we were supposed to have. The final piece of the project, the crown jewel, was the solar array. A state-of-the-art system of photovoltaic panels, seamlessly integrated into the roofline, tied to a battery backup that could power us through a hurricane. It was efficient, it was clean, and it was Clara's favorite part of the design. She called it our little piece of the sun. I spent weeks on the installation myself, a bittersweet labor of love. Each panel I secured in place felt like a promise I was keeping. When I finally flipped the main switch and watched the meter spin backward for the first time, feeding our surplus energy back into the grid, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a year: peace. That peace lasted exactly 2 days. That's when I met Carol. Carol was the president of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association. She moved through the neighborhood not like a resident, but like a warden patrolling her prison yard. She was a woman in her mid-50s with a haircut so sharp it looked like it could cut glass and a perpetual expression that suggested she'd just smelled something foul. My first official interaction with her was an envelope taped to my front door. It wasn't a welcome to the neighborhood fruit basket. It was a crisp, cream-colored piece of stationery with the HOA logo embossed in gold at the top. The letter inside was concise and utterly baffling. It informed me that my unapproved rooftop structures were in violation of Article 4, Section 8 of the Community Bylaws. The structures, it said, constituted a visual nuisance and must be removed within 14 days. A fine of $50 per day would be levied until the property was brought back into compliance. I read it twice, then a third time. Unapproved rooftop structures. I walked outside and looked up at my roof. The solar panels were sleek, black, and perfectly flush with the shingles. They were less obtrusive than a satellite dish, and half the houses on the street had those. My first thought was that it was a mistake. A simple clerical error. I was the new guy, maybe they had my file mixed up. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I grabbed my copy of the HOA bylaws, the 3-inch binder they give you at closing, and looked up Article 4, Section 8. It was about lawn maintenance. Specifically, the acceptable height of decorative grasses. Not a word about rooftops, solar panels, or structures of any kind. I decided a calm, face-to-face conversation was in order. I found her address in the community directory and took a walk over. She was in her front yard, mercilessly pruning a rose bush that seemed to be fighting for its life. "Carol?" I asked, keeping a friendly distance. She turned, her pruning shears held like a weapon. "It's Miss Donaldson to you," she said, her eyes narrowing. "And you're the man in the glass house." I had no idea what that meant. "My name is Sam. I live at 112 Willow Lane. I think there's been a misunderstanding about a letter I received." "There's no misunderstanding," she snapped, snipping a perfectly healthy-looking rosebud clean off its stem. "Your things on the roof. They have to go." "You mean the solar panels?" I asked, still trying to keep my tone light. I checked the bylaws. Article 4, Section 8 is about grass height. There's nothing in there about solar panels. A faint, smug smile touched her lips. You're referring to the old bylaws. The board passed an amendment last month. It hasn't been distributed yet. This felt wrong. It was like a cop pulling you over for a speed limit that was only decided after you'd already driven past. An amendment? Don't those have to be voted on by the homeowners? I certainly didn't get a ballot. The board has discretionary authority to enact provisional regulations for the aesthetic preservation of the community, she said, reciting the line as if from a script. The panels are an eyesore. They lower property values. They're coming down. I felt the first spark of annoyance. I'm an engineer. I live in a world of rules, physics, and clear causality. Her logic was a foreign language. With all due respect, Ms. Donaldson, residential solar arrays have been shown to increase property values. And state law prohibits HOAs from banning them outright. I had done my homework. I knew the law. This was my field. Her eyes flashed. The smugness evaporated, replaced by cold fury. It was the look of a monarch being questioned by a peasant. I am the president of this board. My decision is final. You have 13 days left. She turned her back on me and went back to mutilating her roses. The conversation was over. I walked home, the gears in my head turning. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a power play. She wasn't enforcing a rule, she was inventing one. I had inadvertently challenged her authority, and she was going to make an example of me. The problem for her was, I don't make a very good example. I'm a terrible nail to try and hammer down. I tend to hammer back. The next day, I mailed a certified letter to the HOA board. In it, I calmly and formally requested a copy of the amended bylaw she had cited. I also reiterated the state law protecting solar installations and stated my position that the fines were illegitimate. I was building a paper trail. In my line of work, documentation is everything. You don't build a power grid on handshakes and good faith, you build it on blueprints, permits, and signed orders. I decided to treat Carol like a faulty transformer, identify the problem, document it, and then systematically isolate and remove it. Her response was not a letter. It was an escalation. A week later, the fines started showing up in my mailbox daily. Each one in its own smug, cream-colored envelope. $50. $100. $150. It was absurd. I filed them all neatly in a folder labeled, Carol's Fantasy Finances. Then, she took it to the community Facebook group. She didn't name me directly, but the post was unmistakable. Dear neighbors, it began, it has come to the board's attention that some new residents may not share our community's commitment to aesthetic harmony. Unauthorized industrial-style modifications to homes can negatively impact everyone's property values. Please remember that the HOA bylaws are in place to protect your investment. The comments section was a mix of confusion and sycophantic support for Carol. Thanks for looking out for us, Carol, one wrote. What kind of modifications? Asked another. Carol coyly refused to give specifics, which only fanned the flames of gossip. My next-door neighbor, a retired police detective named Frank, came over that evening, holding his phone. He was a good man, quiet and observant, with eyes that had seen too much but still managed to find a twinkle. Saw the post, he said, shaking his head. She's painting a target on you, Sam. I know, I said, sipping my iced tea. She seems to have a thing for imaginary rules. It's not about rules, Frank said, leaning against my porch railing. It's about control. She's been running this place like her own little kingdom for 5 years. Nobody dares question her. The last family that tried to fight her on the color of their mailbox ended up moving. Well, I said, looking up at my roof where the panels were silently soaking up the afternoon sun, I'm not planning on moving. Frank smiled. Didn't think so. You've got a look about you. Like you know how to wire a bomb. I chuckled. Something like that. I just prefer to use the law. It's less messy. The situation simmered for another week. More letters, more passive-aggressive Facebook posts. I ignored them, continuing to document everything. I was waiting for her next move, expecting another volley of paper threats. But I underestimated her. I underestimated how vicious she was willing to be. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my home office, on a video conference call with a major client. I was doing some consulting work, a complex analysis of a grid failure in another state. It was a high-stakes project. My reputation was on the line. I was in the middle of explaining a cascade failure scenario when my entire office went dark. My monitors, my lights, my router, everything died in an instant. The house fell silent, except for the faint, apologetic beep of the battery backup on my computer kicking in. My first thought was a blackout. A squirrel on a transformer, a downed line somewhere. I excused myself from the call, promising to reconnect as soon as possible, and went to check the circuit breaker panel in my garage. All the breakers were in the correct position. Nothing was tripped. That's when a cold dread washed over me. I walked out the side door of my garage to the main utility box on the exterior wall of my house. The heavy metal door of the box was ajar. And the main breaker, a thick, heavy-duty switch that connected my entire house to the city's power grid, had been physically pulled down into the off position. This was not a power outage. This was sabotage. I stood there for a moment, the silence of my dead house ringing in my ears. This was no longer about fines or bylaws. This was a direct, physical attack on my home. On my livelihood. She had crossed a line. A big, bright, 1,000-volt line. And then I saw her. Carol was standing on the sidewalk, a safe distance away, watching me. She had that same smug, triumphant smile on her face. "Having some trouble, Mr. Sam," she called out, her voice dripping with faux concern. I walked slowly toward her, my anger a cold, dense weight in my chest. "Did you do this?" "Your house is not in compliance," she said, her voice turning hard. "According to the emergency powers vested in me by the board, I can take action to mitigate any threat to the community. Your unauthorized grid connection is a fire hazard. I've disconnected it for everyone's safety." My mind, the mind of an engineer, reeled at the sheer stupidity and danger of what she'd done. A layperson manually operating a main service disconnect. The potential for an arc flash, for electrocution, was immense. But it was the audacity that truly staggered me. "You have no authority to touch my utility box," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "That is a federal offense. It's called tampering with utility equipment." "I have every authority," she sneered. "I am protecting this community from you." That was it. The switch inside me flipped. The peace-seeking man who just wanted to finish his late wife's dream house was gone. In his place was a grid manager facing a critical failure. My protocol was clear: isolate the fault, contain the damage, and then systematically dismantle the source of the problem until it could never cause a failure again. I just stared at her for a long moment. She seemed to expect me to yell, to argue. I didn't either. I turned my back on her, walked back to my utility box, and with a practiced, steady hand, I flipped the main breaker back on. The house hummed back to life behind me. I secured the latch on the box and then, just for good measure, I looped a heavy-duty padlock through it. I walked back to my office, reconnected to my conference call, and apologized for the brief, unexpected power fluctuation. I finished my presentation with cold, sharp precision. But my mind wasn't on cascade failures in another state. It was on the cascade failure right here in Harmony Creek. After the call, I didn't sit and stew. I got to work. The time for reasonable letters was over. This was war now, and she had just handed me my casus belli. Phase 1 was investigation. I was an engineer, not a detective, but the principles were the same. You gather data, analyze patterns, and find the weak points. My first call was to Frank. He was at my door in minutes. I explained what had happened. His face, usually relaxed, hardened into the impassive mask of a cop. "She's lost her mind," he said, his voice low. "Tampering with a utility main. That's not just an HOA violation, Sam. That's a felony." "I know," I said. "But it's my word against hers. I need more than that. I need to understand why she's so obsessed with my solar panels. This isn't about aesthetics. It's about something else." "Power," Frank offered. "Pure and simple." "No," I countered, shaking my head. It feels more specific than that. Her reaction is too extreme. It's disproportionate. It's like poking a bear and finding out it's not guarding a cave, it's guarding a vault. I decided to start with the HOA's finances. As a homeowner, I was entitled to see them. I sent another certified letter, this time from a lawyer I hired, formally requesting a complete, unredacted copy of the association's budget, expense reports, and bank statements for the past 5 years. While I waited for that, I upgraded my home security. I installed several small, high-definition cameras around my property. They were discreet, but they covered every angle, including a direct, clear shot of the main utility box. If she ever touched it again, I would have her dead to rights. I also started digging into public records. I looked up the HOA's corporate filings. I researched Carol Donaldson herself. Property records, business licenses, court filings. I was building a complete schematic of my enemy. Most of it was boring. She owned her house outright. No outstanding liens. No major lawsuits. But I did find one interesting little detail. She was the sole proprietor of a shell company, a limited liability company called Donaldson Community Solutions. Its registered purpose was vague, providing management and maintenance services. It had been incorporated 6 years ago, just before she was elected HOA president. A week later, a thick manila envelope arrived from the HOA's management company. It contained the financial documents I had requested. I spread them out on my dining room table, which quickly began to look like a mission control center. I spent the next 3 nights poring over the numbers, fueled by coffee and a cold, burning anger. For the first 2 years, everything looked normal. Landscaping, pool maintenance, insurance, all the typical expenses of a suburban HOA. But then, 5 years ago, right after Carol took over, a new line item appeared in the budget under utilities. It was a massive, single payment made every month for community electrical services. It was far too high for just the streetlights and the clubhouse pool pump. It was almost 10 times what I would have estimated. My heart started beating a little faster. This was it. This was the anomaly in the data, the flicker on the oscilloscope that tells you something is wrong with the circuit. I cross-referenced the payments. Every single month, for 5 years, a check for community electrical services was made out to one company, Donaldson Community Solutions. Her shell company. The pieces clicked into place with the clean, satisfying snap of a well-thrown breaker. It was a classic embezzlement scheme, elegant in its simplicity. The HOA gets a single, massive power bill from the city for all the common areas. Carol, as president, was the only one who saw the actual bill. She would then create a fake, inflated invoice from her own shell company, pay her company that inflated amount from the HOA's bank account, and then pay the real, much smaller bill to the power company herself. The difference, thousands of dollars every month, went straight into her pocket. For 5 years, she'd been bleeding her neighbors dry, and they had no idea. And my solar panels. They were a threat. They weren't an eyesore. They were a loose thread that could unravel her entire scheme. My house, a net-zero marvel of energy efficiency, was a direct contradiction to the narrative of soaring community electrical costs she must have been spinning. What if other people got the same idea? What if the neighborhood started moving toward energy independence? It would draw attention to the utility bills. It would invite questions. Questions she couldn't afford to answer. Her obsession, her rage, her insane escalation, it all made perfect sense now. It wasn't about control. It was about fear. The fear of being caught. I sat back in my chair, the financial statement spread before me like a map of her crimes. The anger I felt had now cooled and sharpened into a fine, razor-sharp point. This was no longer just about defending my property. This was about justice. She hadn't just harassed me, she had been stealing from everyone. From Frank. From the young family across the street. From the elderly couple on the corner. I now had the why, I had the motive. But I needed irrefutable proof. I needed to catch her in the act, to link her directly to the crime in a way that no lawyer could wriggle out of. It was time to stop investigating and start engineering. I was going to build a trap. I called it Project Blackout. My plan had to be subtle. It had to use her own arrogance and ignorance against her. She thought I was building an unauthorized grid connection, fine. I would lean into that narrative. I would give her exactly what she was looking for, and in doing so, I'd get her to expose herself. The first phase was theater. I ordered a large, industrial-looking battery array and had it delivered to my house on a freight truck. I made sure the delivery was made midday, when I knew Carol would be home and likely watching. The deliveryman used a forklift to place the heavy crate in my driveway. It was all for show. The crate was mostly empty. I spent the next weekend in my open garage, making a great show of installing my new system. I ran thick, heavy-gauge conduit. I mounted impressive-looking, but disconnected, junction boxes on the wall. I wore a hard hat and a tool belt. To anyone watching, and I knew she was watching, it looked like I was building a private power station. Frank would stop by with a beer in the evenings, and we'd talk in low voices while I tinkered with my fake equipment. "She's taking the bait," he said one night, nodding toward her house. The curtains in her living room window twitched. "She's been staring over here all day. Called the city code enforcement office twice this morning. I have a buddy who still works there. He tipped me off." "Perfect," I said, tightening a bolt on a useless piece of metal. "Let her. The more attention she draws to me, the more people will be watching when her world comes crashing down." The next step was to bait the hook. I knew she was desperate to get inside my property, to find some violation she could use to shut me down. Her problem was that she had no legal right to do so. So, I decided to give her a reason. A reason she couldn't resist. She had accused me of running a fire hazard. I was going to give her a fire hazard. I sent a carefully worded email to the entire HOA board, with Carol copied, of course. "Dear board members," I wrote. "In the interest of community transparency, I wish to inform you of a significant upgrade to my home's electrical system. To ensure complete energy independence and to protect my sensitive professional equipment from grid fluctuations, like the recent unexplained outage, I have installed a state-of-the-art battery backup and microgrid management system. The system is fully compliant with all national electrical codes. However, as it is new technology, I wanted to proactively inform the board." I hit send. The email was a landmine. The phrases, unexplained outage, microgrid, and new technology were designed to set off every alarm bell in her paranoid, guilty mind. She would see it as a direct challenge to her authority and a confirmation of her worst fears. It took less than 24 hours. The next afternoon, a truck from the city's Department of Building and Safety pulled up in front of my house. A harried-looking inspector named Miller got out, a clipboard in his hand. And right behind him, pulling up in her pristine luxury sedan, was Carol. She got out of her car with a look of undisguised triumph. This was it. She thought she had me. I met them at the door. I had invited Frank over to help me with a project, so he was conveniently present as a witness. "Mr. Sam," the inspector said, looking uncomfortable. "We received an anonymous complaint about an unpermitted private power generation facility at this address. Cites an imminent fire risk." "Anonymous, huh?" I said, glancing at Carol, who was doing a poor job of pretending to be a concerned bystander. "A power generation facility. That sounds exciting. Please, come in. I'll show you the facility." I led them into my garage. Carol followed, her eyes wide, practically salivating at the prospect of finding a violation. She scanned the array of conduits and boxes I had set up. "This is it," she declared to the inspector. "Look at this. It's an industrial site. It's a clear violation." I ignored her and turned to Inspector Miller. "This is my battery backup system," I explained calmly. "Here are the manufacturer's spec sheets. Here is the installation plan I drafted. And here," I said, handing him a thin folder, "is the permit, which was approved by your office 2 weeks ago." Miller took the folder and began to read. His eyebrows shot up. He walked over to my setup, looked at the main junction, and then back at the permit. He checked the wiring gauge and the conduit mounts. Carol's triumphant smile began to falter. "That permit must be a forgery," she sputtered. Miller turned to her, his expression now one of annoyance. "Ma'am, this is a valid permit, properly filed and approved. And frankly," he said, turning back to my work, "this is one of the cleanest, most professional installations I've ever seen. This guy could teach our master class." He turned to me. Everything here is not only up to code, it exceeds it. There is no violation. I'm sorry to have wasted your time. This was the moment. The trap was about to spring. No trouble at all, Inspector, I said smoothly. I'm glad to have it cleared up. Actually, while I have you and a former police detective here, I said, gesturing to Frank, I did have a safety concern of my own I wanted to ask about. Carol froze. I walked over to a workbench and picked up a binder. It was the HOA financial reports. I've been reviewing the community's utility expenses, I said, my tone one of genuine, neighborly concern. And the numbers seem... well, they seem astronomically high. For just the streetlights and a small clubhouse, the HOA is apparently paying more for electricity than a small factory. I opened the binder to the page showing the payments to Donaldson Community Solutions. I'm an energy systems engineer, so these numbers jump out at me. I'm worried there might be a major fault in the community's wiring. A ground fault, maybe. Something that's drawing a huge amount of phantom power. That could be a real fire risk, couldn't it? I looked from the inspector to Frank. I hadn't accused anyone of anything. I was just a concerned resident, using my professional expertise to point out a potential safety issue. Inspector Miller looked at the ledger, and his professional curiosity was piqued. That is a high number, he mused. You'd need to be running some heavy machinery to pull that kind of current. Frank stepped forward, playing his part perfectly. That's very concerning, Sam. As a board, the HOA has a fiduciary duty to investigate any potential waste or safety hazard. Carol, were you aware of this discrepancy? All eyes turned to Carol. The color drained from her face. She was cornered, trapped in a scenario she had created. She had brought the city inspector here to find a fire hazard, and now she was being presented with a real one that led directly to her. Her composure, already fragile, shattered like cheap glass. This is ridiculous, she shrieked, her voice cracking. This is a private financial matter. You have no right. Ma'am, the inspector said sternly, he's raising a legitimate public safety concern. A major electrical fault could be dangerous. He's the danger. Carol screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. He's trying to distract you. He's trying to undermine me. He probably forged those documents, just like he forged the permit. I am the president of this association, and I am ordering you to leave my community. She was hysterical, her eyes wild. She had lost control of the situation, and it was causing her to short-circuit. Her public meltdown in front of a city official and a retired detective was more damning than any financial statement. She was acting guilty. She was looking guilty. Inspector Miller just shook his head, packed up his clipboard, and left, muttering something about crazy HOA people. Frank and I stood in the garage as Carol peeled out of my driveway, her tires squealing in protest. Phase 1 complete, I said quietly. That was beautiful, Sam, Frank said, a slow grin spreading across his face. You didn't just play her. You played her like a violin. The seed of doubt was planted. But I knew Carol. She wasn't the type to retreat and lick her wounds. She was the type to double down. To scorch the earth. The final, most vicious escalation was coming. I had to be ready for it. I didn't have to wait long. Cornered animals are the most dangerous, and Carol was lashing out with the ferocity of a rabid wolverine. Her public humiliation in my garage had pushed her over the edge. Her attacks became personal, vicious, and aimed at the one thing I had left, my professional reputation. She started a new rumor campaign, this one far more insidious. She went door to door, whispering to neighbors that my unregulated power plant was causing dangerous power surges. Old Mrs. Gable's television suddenly went on the fritz. It was my fault. The Hendersons' garage door opener started acting up. My solar panels were to blame. She was manufacturing a crisis and casting me as the villain. It was nonsense, of course. My system was isolated from the neighbors' homes. If anything, my contribution to the grid would have a stabilizing effect. But fear is more powerful than facts, especially when it comes to people's homes. Some of my neighbors, people who had been friendly before, started looking at me with suspicion. They'd cross the street to avoid walking past my house. The sense of community Clara and I had so looked forward to was being poisoned against me. But that was just the opening salvo. Her main attack was far more direct. I received a certified letter not from the HOA, but from the State Board of Professional Engineers. A formal complaint had been filed against me, demanding a review of my license. The complaint, filed by an anonymous concerned citizen, alleged gross negligence, endangerment of the public, and the operation of an unlicensed utility. It was a word-for-word recitation of Carol's paranoid fantasies. This was a direct shot at my heart. My professional license was the culmination of my life's work. It was my livelihood. Without it, I couldn't consult, I couldn't sign off on plans, I couldn't even call myself an engineer. The complaint was baseless and would almost certainly be dismissed, but the investigation process itself was a grueling, stressful ordeal that could take months. She was trying to bury me in paperwork and legal fees, to bleed me dry emotionally and financially. I felt a surge of white-hot rage, but I forced it down. Panic is a cascading failure. Logic is a surge protector. I had anticipated this. I had prepared for it. It was time to bring in my final asset. That evening, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Sam?" a woman's voice asked, hesitant and nervous. "It is." "Who's this?" "My name is Brenda. I used to be the treasurer on the HOA board. I heard about what's been happening." Brenda. I remembered Frank mentioning her. She was the one who had been pushed out by Carol a few years back for asking too many questions. "I think I can help you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Carol is a thief." I knew it then, and I know it now. When she forced me off the board, I made copies of everything. The real financial records. The bank statements from before she set up her shell company. The real utility bills. "I have the proof, Sam. The real proof." My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. The smoking gun. The final, undeniable piece of evidence. "Brenda, you have no idea how important this is. Where can we meet?" We met the next day in a coffee shop in the next town over. Brenda was a nervous woman in her 60s, clutching a worn leather briefcase to her chest as if it contained state secrets. In a way, it did. She opened the briefcase on the table between us. Inside were neat folders filled with documents. She walked me through them, her hands shaking slightly. It was all there, in black and white. The original power bills from the utility company, showing the true, modest costs. The bank statements showing the checks deposited into Carol's, Donaldson Community Solutions, account. The ledgers from before and after she took over, showing a clear, dramatic spike in utility costs that coincided perfectly with her presidency. She had stolen over $200,000 from her neighbors over 5 years. "She threatened me," Brenda said, her eyes welling up. "She said she'd ruin my husband's business if I ever spoke up. We couldn't afford to fight her. So I kept quiet. But what she's doing to you isn't right. It's time for her to be stopped." I looked at the mountain of evidence on the table. It was beautiful. It was a perfectly designed circuit, with every connection clear and every component's function undeniable. "Brenda," I said, my voice thick with gratitude. "You're not just helping me. You're helping this entire community. You're a hero." I took the documents and spent the next 48 hours scanning every single page, organizing them into a clear, chronological narrative of fraud. I compiled my own data logs from my system, which showed the actual power consumption of my house versus the community grid. I wrote a detailed, 10-page summary, complete with charts and diagrams, explaining the embezzlement scheme in precise, engineering terms. When I was done, I didn't call my lawyer. I didn't go to the local police. Carol's crime, using the mail to send fraudulent invoices and electronic bank transfers to move the stolen money, was a federal offense. This was bigger than a small-town issue. This was wire fraud. I made 2 calls. The first was to the state's Attorney General's office. The second was to the nearest field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I spent an afternoon in a sterile government office, walking 2 stone-faced investigators through my findings. I laid out Brenda's documents, my financial analysis, my security camera footage of Carol tampering with my utility box, and a copy of the frivolous complaint she had filed against my engineering license. I didn't present it as a grieving widower being harassed. I presented it as an engineer submitting a report on a critical system failure. They listened intently, without interruption. When I was finished, one of them looked at his partner and then back at me. "Mr. Sam," he said, a hint of a smile on his face. "You've done about 90% of our job for us. This is one of the most well-documented civilian submissions I've ever seen." They took my evidence. They told me not to say a word to anyone. They told me to wait. A week later, I received an email. It was from the HOA. Carol, brimming with a fatal dose of overconfidence, was calling a special community meeting. The agenda: to discuss and vote upon a special assessment to be levied against the property at 112 Willow Lane to cover damages and legal fees incurred due to ongoing bylaw violations. She was trying to get the very people she was robbing to pay for her legal fight against me. The audacity was breathtaking. The email also included a time, a date, and a location: the community clubhouse, 1 week from today. The stage was set. The audience was invited. It was time for the final act. The night of the meeting, the air in the clubhouse was thick with tension. It felt like the static charge before a lightning strike. Nearly the entire neighborhood was there, crammed into the small room on uncomfortable folding chairs. They looked confused, anxious, and angry. Carol had whipped them into a frenzy of misinformation. I walked in with Frank a few minutes before it was set to begin. A hush fell over the room. I saw the suspicious glances, the whispers behind cupped hands. I ignored them and took a seat in the front row. I wanted a good view. Carol was at a podium at the front of the room, flanked by the 2 other board members, a pair of meek-looking men who looked like they'd been hypnotized. She was beaming, radiating an aura of absolute power. She saw my arrival not as a threat, but as the final humiliation of her enemy. She thought this was her victory lap. She banged a gavel, and the meeting began. "Thank you all for coming," she started, her voice smooth and practiced. "I know there has been a lot of concern recently about a situation here in Harmony Creek. A situation that threatens the very fabric of our community and the value of our homes." She spent the next 15 minutes painting a masterpiece of fiction. She spoke of rogue construction, flagrant disregard for our rules, and dangerous, unapproved electrical equipment. She never used my name, but every word was a poisoned dart aimed directly at me. She then presented her grand finale, a motion to levy a $20,000 special assessment against my property. "This is to cover the cost of hiring specialized legal counsel," she explained, "and to conduct an independent safety review of the industrial equipment that has been illegally installed." A murmur went through the crowd. $20,000 was a shocking number. "All in favor?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to oppose her. Before anyone could raise their hand, I stood up. "Point of order, Madam President," I said, my voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension. Carol's face tightened. "You are out of order. You are not recognized." "According to Robert's Rules of Order, which this HOA's charter adopts," I said, holding up a copy of the bylaws, "a homeowner who is the subject of a punitive financial motion has the right to address the assembly before a vote. I'd like to exercise that right." She was trapped by her own rules. She couldn't deny me without exposing her own hypocrisy. "Fine," she hissed through gritted teeth. "You have 2 minutes." I walked to the front of the room. I hadn't brought a podium. I just stood before my neighbors. I had also brought a projector and a laptop, which I had quietly set up before the meeting began. With a click of a button, the wall behind Carol lit up. "My name is Sam," I began. "And I live at 112 Willow Lane. Ms. Donaldson is right about one thing. There is a situation that threatens this community. But it's not my solar panels." The first image on the screen was a side-by-side comparison. On the left was the actual monthly power bill from the utility company for the community's common areas, $48,217. On the right was the invoice from Donaldson Community Solutions for the same month, $4,500. A collective gasp went through the room. "For the last 5 years," I continued, my voice steady, "our HOA has been the victim of a systematic fraud. We have been paying for community electrical services through a company owned by a single person." I clicked to the next slide. It was a copy of the state's corporate filing for Donaldson Community Solutions, LLC. Owner, Carol Donaldson. The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting, pointing at Carol. Her face had gone from triumphant to terrified. She looked like a cornered rat. Lies. These are forged documents, she shrieked over the noise. Are they? I asked calmly. I clicked again. The next slide showed a bank statement from the HOA account, showing the payment to her company. The slide after that showed the corresponding deposit into her company's account. I had a slide for every month for the last year. It was a relentless, methodical presentation of the truth. I am an engineer, I told them. I deal in data. And the data shows that over $200,000 of our HOA dues have been funneled into Ms. Donaldson's private bank account. Carol was completely unraveling. He's the criminal. He's the one with the dangerous equipment. He tampered with the power grid. Speaking of tampering, I said, my voice dropping. I clicked to the final slide. It was a crystal clear, high-definition video from my security camera. It showed Carol, plain as day, marching up to my utility box, pulling open the door, and yanking down the main breaker, plunging my house into darkness. The room fell into a dead, stunned silence. They were watching their president commit a felony. Carol stared at the screen, at her own guilty image, and something inside her broke. The facade of the powerful, competent community leader dissolved into pure, raw panic. I did it for you, she screamed at the crowd, her voice a ragged, desperate plea. I did it for all of you. This place is a lot of work. I deserve that money. I do everything for this community. I am this community. It was a full confession, blurted out in a moment of pure, self-immolating panic. And right on cue, two men who had been standing quietly at the back of the room began to walk forward. They weren't in uniform, but they moved with a calm authority that instantly commanded attention. They were the FBI agents I had spoken to. They flanked a stunned Carol at the podium. Carol Donaldson, one of them said, his voice devoid of emotion, you are under arrest for wire fraud and embezzlement. That's when her shriek echoed across the manicured lawns. You can't do this. I am the president. This entire community answers to me. As they cuffed her, her wild eyes found mine in the crowd. The look of pure, undiluted hatred she gave me could have curdled steel. You'll regret this, she screamed, as they led her from the room. I'll destroy you. You'll never be safe here. It was the last, hollow threat of a tyrant who had just lost her kingdom. The circuit was broken. The fault was cleared. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The community was in shock, but it was the shock of liberation, like prisoners of war seeing their camp gates thrown open. Frank was unanimously elected as the interim HOA president, a position he accepted with a reluctant sigh. The first order of business for the new board was to void every fine Carol had ever levied against me. Their second was to issue a formal apology on behalf of the community. Their third was to pass a new bylaw, which I helped draft, not only protecting the right to install solar panels but actively encouraging green energy initiatives. Carol's downfall was total. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had compiled, she took a plea bargain. She was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Her house was seized and sold to pay back the $200,000 she had stolen from the HOA's coffers. She lost everything, her home, her money, her freedom, and the twisted sense of power she craved more than anything. With the chaos over, a quiet peace settled back over Harmony Creek. A real peace, this time. Not the tense, enforced silence of Carol's reign, but a genuine sense of neighborliness. People started talking to each other again. The community Facebook group, once a forum for her decrees and denunciations, became a place where people organized block parties and shared gardening tips. I finally finished my work on the house. Every room was just as Clara and I had designed it. I often found myself sitting on the back porch in the evenings, watching the sun go down, feeling her presence in the quiet hum of the house she had imagined into being. My solar panels became something of a local landmark. People who had once eyed them with suspicion now pointed them out with a sense of pride. They were no longer a symbol of defiance, but a symbol of resilience. A testament to the fact that one person, armed with the truth and a little bit of technical know-how, could stand up to a bully and win. A few months after Carol was sentenced, Frank came over with a couple of beers. We sat on the porch, watching the dusk settle. You know, he said, taking a sip, the new treasurer ran the numbers. Since you hooked up your system, the community's overall grid consumption has dropped by about 15%. Your surplus power is feeding back into the local grid, lowering everyone's bills. I smiled. It was the part of my plan I had never told anyone. My system was always intentionally oversized. I was an electrical engineer who specialized in grid management. I knew exactly how to build a system that wouldn't just power my own home, but would subtly support the homes connected to the same local transformer. I just wanted to keep a promise to my wife, I said. She wanted us to have our own little piece of the sun. Frank looked up at the sleek black panels, now dark against the twilight sky. Well, turns out you had enough to share. He was right. The fight with Carol had never really been about the solar panels. It was about what they represented. She saw them as a challenge to her power. But for me, and for Clara, they were always a symbol of something much simpler, the idea of creating more light than you consume and giving the rest back to the world. In the end, that's exactly what I did. I took the darkness she threw at me, and I used it to power an entire community. And that, I think, is the best kind of engineering there is.